This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. If you think John Boehner's lawsuit against the president will be laughed out of court, wait till you find out that when you try to sue, it's no laughing matter. President Obama's first technology advisor has some advice on how partnerships between the feds and corporations can improve government services. And finally, Bill Press talks with D.C. Mayor for Life, Marion. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. When you sign up for cable, join a gym, or buy a phone, you've given up your right to sue. Policy analyst Lina Khan explains how the courts let us sign away our legal rights. And we say hello to Lina Khan, policy analyst for the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative with the New America Foundation, where she researches the concentration of power in America's political economy. Cum laude graduate of Williams College, she reports on agricultural, industrial, and financial markets and the laws that shape them. Lina Khan, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Good to be here.
And we appreciate you joining us. In a recent article in Washington Monthly, you expose how some of the country's biggest corporations have used conservative court rulings to immunize themselves from consumer lawsuits. This is sounding rather un-American, is it not?
It is indeed rather un-American. And, it's not just consumer lawsuits. It's employee lawsuits, civil rights lawsuits, it's antitrust lawsuits. And, I think it's important to understand that this phenomena, what it means is that scores and scores of laws that, activists worked decades to pass, that those can no longer be enforced. So it's not only un-American, it's really undemocratic, because what it means is that we now have a lot of laws on the books that effectively are not being enforced anymore because you've eroded the right of people to bring lawsuits and to hold companies accountable. So I think it's important to understand kind of democratically what this means.
So basically then, when we buy a product or service, the agreement or terms of service that we so blithely sign gives away our right to take the company to court if, in fact, it fails to deliver?
Exactly. So oftentimes, be it with the gym membership, or if you're signing up for a phone contract, or with a bank, or even if you're signing an employer contract, oftentimes what that contract will say in the fine print is that if anything ever goes wrong between us, if there's ever any kind of dispute, we cannot go to court. We will instead get it settled by a private arbitrator that the company, will choose. And what this means in practice is that, there's no kind of public accountability anymore. And it means that, situations where you might willingly opt into arbitration are now instead being forced on you. So, it's a pretty radical shift. We've gotten here in pretty, small steps. But there were a couple of decisions in 2011 and 2013 that have kind of radically expanded the purview in which arbitration can now be used.
Well, and there's the argument that corporations have been using, is that there's too much frivolous litigation going on and that we need tort reform. Is that an accurate, viable argument? And if it is arbitration the right solution?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's language in kind of that we started seeing in the late 70s and early 80s. There was this huge movement around tort reform and around this idea that Americans were excessively litigious, that lawyers were killing America, were strangling business, and it's true that for a variety of reasons, the amount of litigation we saw in the 70s had increased. And it was partly because, for example, we had civil rights laws passed in the 60s. So there were just more people who were, had rights under the law. We'd seen the proliferation of cars, that there were more car accidents and more, disputes with insurance companies and automobile manufacturers. So there were actual, real reasons why we had seen litigation increase. The kind of response to that was very ideological in some ways. I mean, this was the same time that we were seeing the rise of kind of the Chicago school way of looking at law, of the rise of the law and economics movement, which really just saw a much smaller role for government and for law to be able to regulate private power. And I think since then, it's just been this really dominant myth in some ways. I mean, one thing that was interesting was actually looking at the numbers and finding out that on a whole series of cases, we've actually seen litigation fall. So, for example, with civil rights cases commenced in district courts, we've actually seen them decline pretty significantly between 1996 and 2013. Same goes for personal injury cases, or the total number of civil cases. And in some instances, it's pretty significant. I mean, it's upwards of 30% declines across the board. I mean, it should be said that a lot of experts and lawyers actually predict that we'll continue to see these fall. Mostly because now with these arbitration clauses, you can't go to court in the first place. So I think, we're already seeing a decline in litigation, and it'll probably increase the decline.
We're speaking with Lina Khan, policy analyst for the Markets Enterprise and Resiliency Initiative at the New America Foundation. You mentioned personal injury, and it makes me think of the famous case of the woman who sued McDonald's for hot coffee. And a legitimate case that McDonald's settled because it was wrong. I mean, that was a pretty serious matter, right?
It was a pretty serious matter. The lady suffered third-degree burns. She ended up requiring skin graft. I think it's important to remember that it was far from an isolated event. McDonald's had received hundreds of reports of injury from its coffee, including reports of third-degree burns, and it paid settlements in some cases. I think, one thing that's also important to know about arbitration is that oftentimes if you're only arbitrating cases with individuals, it means that there's no real incentive to stop the practice in a big way. So when there's a big class action suit, it holds a company accountable because, there's all this information in the public domain, there's a lot of publicity, and instead when you're just kind of paying off individual by individual, it lets you kind of build in that cost just as a cost of business. So in the way that, people criticize DOJ for just fining the banks because they say, that basically just lets banks build in these fines as just a cost of, these larger schemes that are making them more money, you can also say that of companies, that, by letting them just settle individual by individual in this private setting, it's really creating an incentive for them to continue these bad practices.
Yeah. Is it true also that under a recent spate of court decisions, professional arbitrators hired by corporations can ignore the law on civil rights, labor protections, antitrust matters without anyone looking over their shoulders?
So, yeah, it's interesting. When it comes to professional arbitrators, it's basically because these are not public courts, they're just far less standards in terms of, how arbitrators are held accountable to the law. So judges have become a lot more deferential to arbitrators. In some states, arbitrators don't even have to be lawyers. In many cases, there are lawyers, but they don't have to be. And the way in which they are reading the law ends up being given huge deference, which, again, is it just shows how far we've come. Because when the Federal Arbitration Act was passed, it was not intended as a way for arbitrators to be interpreting law. They were supposed to just be interpreting contracts, which are, these documents written between parties. The idea that, you had these private arbitrators ruling on public law with massive implications for individuals, that was just not something that was considered by Congress back in the day. And it would be something that would, really make them troubled.
And so with no public accounting of the arbitration process, we can't really know how well that system works, can we?
Well, that's another big question. You see these studies on both sides of, people, these law firms putting out studies saying arbitration is actually really great for individuals. And then you have a lot of groups like Public Citizen, which has done some great work on this, documenting how that's in fact not true. But at the end of the day, you're right. Because so many of these proceedings are private, the information is private, we're actually pretty blind when it comes to being able to assess the system in any macro way. It should be said that the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because of provisions in Dodd-Frank is now assessing the use of arbitration in financial contracts. They released their preliminary report last year and are planning to release, the full report at some point this year. And they've been able to, get huge data sets from some of the big arbitrators. But I think your larger point stands that, because of this information being private, we have very little ability to assess how it's working for most people.
Yeah, I mean, a sense of wild, wild west going on here in terms of arbitration. That's what strikes me.
Yeah, I mean, it's intended as an unregulated or a less regulated system because it was intended to be used in these very isolated instances. So this idea that this unregulated system is instead kind of secretly spread so widely and in some ways is replacing kind of the public courts in some instances, I think that's what's really troubling.
Is there legislative or other kinds of solutions to the way corporations are bullying consumers?
It's a good question, and I think a lot of this is, at the end of the day, going to come down to Congress. Congress really needs to kind of reassert what the original Federal Arbitration Act was and how it was, intended to be used in very isolated circumstances. We've seen legislation proposed. Al Franken has been really great on this. He's been, proposing the Arbitration Fairness Act, which would grossly limit how arbitration can be used. It would not be allowed to be used in routine consumer contracts and worker contracts and antitrust cases. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that go anywhere. We've seen some riders included in this bill or that bill that limits, how arbitration can be used, say, against service members and that kind of thing. But we haven't really seen any kind of holistic attempt to address this yet.
Lina, you're not saying Congress has stalled on something, have you? Or is that what you're? No, that can't possibly be. Oh my goodness. My fear is that we're going to have to talk again sometime in the not too distant future about this same topic, and it's really a shame. It really is. I just don't understand how we can let it go and continue to let it go this way.
Yeah, I think it's a really big deal. Frankly, I'm surprised that it's not getting more attention. I think one of the reasons it's not getting as much attention is because oftentimes it's framed as just this, have individuals lost the right to sue, which is an important question, but it's a much bigger issue than that. The real question is not can I or can I not sue this company. The bigger question is can our laws be enforced? And I think once you kind of expand the frame and understand that the stakes are democracy, the stakes are laws that Congress is passing, I think it becomes a much more powerful conversation.
Indeed. Lina Khan, policy analyst for the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative at the New America Foundation, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Lina, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. President Obama's first chief technology officer, Aneesh Chopra, says innovation is the key to improving everything important government does, from healthcare to education. And we'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Gosh, has it already been 2 weeks since Congress took a vacation? Those poor stiffs must be pooped from trying to catch up on all the heavy lifting that piled up while they were away from their lawmaking duties. And, gosh again, in less than 2 weeks, Congress will go back on vacation, this time for a 5-week summer recess. So much to do, so little time. That's why GOP Speaker John Boehner is now cracking the whip. He's spurring his colleagues to pick up the pace and stay focused on his #1 national priority, namely, suing the President of the United States. It seems that Obama has had the audacity to try to do something about some of the bubbling crises that Congress, or more specifically the House, or even more specifically Boehner and his Republican stalwarts, have been ignoring, stalling, or playing politics with. So, of course, the President must be sued to prevent him from taking actions to help people. The speaker's logic might seem a tad confusing or just plain weird to you, so I'll let him clarify his meaning for you. The legislative branch, Boehner intoned in a recent op-ed, has an obligation to defend the rights and responsibilities of the American people. Huh? Defend the responsibilities of the American people? What does that mean? And speaking of obligations, doesn't the top official of the House of Representatives have an obligation to at least try communicating with the people in sensible English sentences? This is Jim Hightower saying, but then, if your ideas are gobbledygook, your explanations will be too. He's wasting legislative time and frittering away taxpayer dollars on a frivolous lawsuit while refusing to lift a finger for America's sinking middle class. Just as Nero fiddled while Rome burned, Boehner is in Washington suing while Americans fume.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. There's a lot of negative talk about government efficiency, but President Obama's first chief technology officer, Aneesh Chopra, says innovation can and will improve things. And we say hello to Aneesh Chopra, who served as the first technology officer of the United States appointed by President Obama. Previously was Virginia's Secretary of Technology and a candidate for the Democratic nomination of Lieutenant Governor. He is the author of a new book, Innovative State, How New Technologies Can Transform Government. Aneesh Chopra, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, it is great to have you and glad you can take the time to be with us. So innovation is kind of a buzzword these days. What does innovation mean in today's world?
Well, first and foremost, innovation has two core concepts: the idea of a new invention or a new process, and more importantly, its ability to scale the market. What that means is there are lots of good ideas, but what makes it an innovation is if those ideas can find their way to improve the lives of consumers, of individuals in their daily routine. And so to me, innovation in the public sector is about how we can deliver government services in new and more compelling ways. And you measure innovation by their impact on real people in their daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, you write that government should use information technology to become more open. But, I mean, really, there are a lot of Americans that think that government has gone way too far in collecting and using data. I mean, how do you answer that?
Well, it's a great dichotomy in that we wear multiple hats in government. On the first principle, the idea is that if the government is already authorized and collecting information, that in today's environment with newer technologies, it should be made available back to the American people who funded it in formats that computers can participate in or to compute against. When it comes to new ideas or new policies that relate to how and why government collects data in the first place, well, that's a policy judgment. And in the case of national security, I think the president has really kicked off a thoughtful review to understand whether or not we've gone too far or there are alternative methods to keep us safe without some of the practices that we've been learning about with respect to national security. So these are subtly two different questions. Why is the government collecting data, which is a good one, but then if it is legally appropriate to do so, how it should be put back into the public domain to maximize the benefits to the American people. And that's the dichotomy I try to cover in the book.
Mm-hmm. I mean, essentially, is it categorizing what's okay to look at and what's not okay to look at in terms of the public?
Well, the policy, when President Obama took office, his first day, he placed a bit of a thumb on the scale, I guess, by issuing an open government directive. It was a memorandum asking his agencies to essentially make information disclosure a default. That is to say, if you have data on any topic, whether it be food safety or information about even who visits the president himself through the visitor logs, that the default setting should be that data be made available to the public. Obviously, you want to take a screen to make sure you're not violating someone's privacy or you're not compromising national security. But after you make those two determinations, that data should be made available. And we've actually created a bit of a catalog at data.gov that would allow us to basically present back to the American people hundreds of thousands of data sets that they've paid for and now can be given back to them in a form that entrepreneurs and innovators can put to better use.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Aneesh Chopra, who served as the first Chief Technology Officer of the United States. He was also a former Virginia Secretary of Technology, and he's the author of the book, Innovative State, How New Technologies Can Transform Government. Now, you say that innovation is as American as apple pie. So what are some examples, and what was the federal government's role in developing new technologies over the last couple of centuries?
Well, this actually was a pretty eye-opener for me. In the process of writing the book, I was living in the contemporary. The idea that we need to close the gap between how our lives in the private sector have evolved and improved based on technology and how difficult it's been to incorporate those same technologies in government. But in the process of writing the book, I looked back to American history, and you can go all the way back to the Founding Fathers and start to realize it had been very much the case that government had been not only at pace with the private sector, but frankly, in many cases had led. One of my favorite examples is that the 1870 census. It was a time of significant immigration, and based on the hand-based counting of the census, it was the case that it was expected to be 14 or maybe even longer years to calculate the 1870 census. And facing this difficult task, an entrepreneurial government employee at the census designed the first tabulating machines so we could begin to automate the census process. That was so successful, he spun that off into a separate company, which formed one of the foundational technologies for what we now know as IBM. So you actually have the story of a government employee birthing IBM. And you could go across history in any one of these generations to see how a more nimble, more innovative government had actually adopted techniques that were so successful that they rolled out into the private sector. And that's a lot of what I try to cover in the book. The innovative state isn't about a new idea. It's about returning to the history of America and to do so using the current crop of new technologies.
Mm-hmm. Learn from history, right? I mean, we talk about that all the time. Sure.
Yes, that's absolutely right. In fact, one of my favorite stories, I'm a Virginian, as you mentioned, Mr. Jefferson. We hold Mr. Jefferson in quite high regard. It was his typical routine to collect weather data and to jot it in a ledger and to share it with people who had similar hobbies across the United States. And in fact, when he became president, one of his assignments to Lewis and Clark, when they were, obviously visiting and touring the West, he directed them to collect data on their trip on weather, on climate, and then to make that data freely available to others so that we could shine light and get collectively smarter about the country. So open data actually has had its origins all the way back to our founding fathers.
So IBM started in 1870, and the Weather Channel started with Lewis and Clark.
Well, it's not that far from reality. I mean, in fact, today's $5 billion a year annual weather industry today derives the bulk of their data from the same common pool. It's coming out of the Commerce Department in an agency called NOAA, which funds all the satellites and sensors, collects all the raw data, and then opens it up at no cost and no intellectual property constraint so that the Weather Channel and others can take the data and build even more compelling products and services on top. Imagine if the Weather Channel had to float their own satellites to compete with the television news. And you understand that, in fact, this collaborative, symbiotic relationship on data has had long origins, especially in sectors of the economy like weather.
Yeah, interesting. So what is the proper role in a transparent and free economy of government partnering with private interests to advance technology?
I capture this subject in the book pretty extensively. It seems to me that we've been facing a false choice in the traditional debate about the role of government. Either it's centralized, top-down, government picking winners and losers, or it's laissez-faire, let the free market do what it wants, we'll see what happens. The reality is life is quite in between those two extremes. And believe it or not, it was former President Herbert Hoover, who's not someone I normally think of as a role model for innovation, but in his prior life, he was Secretary of Commerce, and he tried to juxtapose this dichotomy and struggle with the fact that the American airline industry, then very nascent, was not doing very well. And it turns out that he had a new third model, a model I write about in the book, which he referred to as the associative state. And it has a lot more to do with what today you might call pre-competitive research and development. So you're not picking one company and saying, I declare you to be the best, but rather it's an enabling technology that would allow others to flourish. So in the case of airlines, under Hoover's leadership, the precursor to NASA put some engineers on the typical problem of engine cowlings and on wing design, airfoils. And the success of those technologies were freely available for Boeing and then Douglas. And if you remember the heyday of American airline manufacturing, it was the Boeing 247 and the DC-3. Both shared common government-sponsored wing design and engine cowlings. So it tells you that there's an opportunity to leverage and harvest the power of government to open up new market opportunities without having to go as far as picking winners and losers. That spirit of the associative state is what embodies what I call the impatient convening role of government. And you've seen us put that to work in areas of opening up healthcare IT, smart grid technologies, new learning technologies that allow us to personalize the instruction for every child. That's the spirit we took in some of those examples I cite in the book.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, I have to ask you, and of course I mentioned the government's first chief technology officer. What the heck went wrong in the Obamacare rollout? Should we stop contracting out major policy initiatives?
Well, it's thankfully we can look back at having it recovered quickly with the 8 million plus enrollees. But I do think it's important to learn the key lessons from that experience. And I'll say three things about it. First, procurement absolutely is broken in technology, and we took a stab at fixing it in the first term of the Obama administration. In fact, a bipartisan act of Congress allowed us to think of a more innovative approach to procurement. It's called prizes, challenges, and competition. In fact, I have a chapter in the book dedicated to the idea you don't pay for people who wrote the best proposal, you pay for the best result, and you honor all the teams that come in who have to actually produce something that works, and you pay them on the outcome as opposed to what happens on the front end. So step number one is we got to fix the procurement, and that clearly was broken in this case. Number two, I think there's also a lot to say about the importance of just how you implement, kind of project management in government. Clearly there was a shortfall here of testing, of overarching project management, and there's tried and true methodologies that have been working. It was unfortunate in this case that we saw some of the challenges of, difficult testing, changes in requirements late in the game. And those, I think, are, in hindsight, avoidable mistakes that the president will obviously root out to make sure they don't happen again. But there's a third point, and I'd like to actually say healthcare.gov is actually a really positive case study in the book, but not the version that went live in 2013. The very first deliverable of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, by July 1, HHS, the Health and Human Services Department, had to publish healthcare.gov as a catalog of all public and private insurance options that were available in the country at the time, almost like an Expedia.com for shopping on the existing broken insurance market. Mm-hmm. That went off without a hitch, and that embodied all the key principles of this book. Not only did they apply sort of a lean startup methodology to how they built the site, but they also adopted principles of openness. Today, as we speak, the U.S. News and World Report Health Insurance Finder, much like the weather.com story I mentioned earlier, is fully powered by the data from the original healthcare.gov, and it's still true to this day. So you had a very low-cost, agile, 90-day project turned around, led by my successor, Todd Park, who met the goals and objectives that the Congress laid out. And it was so successful, President Obama was the first sitting president to actually demonstrate a website, which he posted as a video on whitehouse.gov. So a lot to say about healthcare.gov. I talk about it in the book a great deal. But if you peel back the onion, a lot of the key principles of the book held true in that first version that went live. It just went in the wrong direction when they went down the traditional procurement path for the site that was to go live in the fall of 2013.
And this only supports the idea that you don't just toss the whole thing out, you just fix what's broken and you move forward, really. I mean...
Well, it also requires having a talented engineer like Todd Park and a brilliant executive like Jeff Zients at the helm, whom I've known for many, many years, to really right that ship. You would note, for example, that states like Maryland and Oregon didn't have access to the same talent that had to recover, so many of them just didn't have the same recovery that you saw with the federal site. And in fact, the ultimate irony is that states like Oregon are now looking to partner with the federal site, even though they had a bit of a head start on building their own.
Yeah. Before we let you go, what facets of the economy do you feel need the most innovation right now?
Healthcare, energy, and education. These are regulated sectors of the economy or run in large part with public sector management. And they're the key to unlocking, I don't mean to be too partisan, but I am, of course, a Democrat. They're really key to unlocking the Democratic agenda. Healthcare access is critical, and we celebrate the 8 million enrollees. But the real important point is that every American has the ability to access affordable insurance so they can get the right care at the right time and in the right setting. Now, unfortunately, we're just in the first or second inning of that transformation of the industry. So we need a lot of innovation right now. And thankfully, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, a lot of entrepreneurs are actually in that mode of both making money and solving a problem that will improve our economy in the long run. Energy, obviously, we have to move towards an energy-independent future. We need clean energy. And I write about the book a couple of examples here. I talk about the need to improve energy efficiency using data. So we talk about the fact that when the EPA had their first energy competition to find ways to reduce costs in buildings, it was a dorm room at University of North Carolina that used data to make it easier for them to save money on their utility bill. I think they cut their energy bill over 25% just by looking at data in a smarter way. And then last but not least, education. I think we talked about the need that every child deserves a shot at the American dream, and our educational system today is not really supporting especially women and minorities and those pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The answer in part is more funding for education, but as I argue in the book, it also is about personalized learning and innovation. Not every child learns the same way, and if we can be smarter about meeting the kids where they are and empower teachers with the tools they need, they can be what they've always been, which is the stewards of excellence in learning in their classrooms and, frankly, outside of their classrooms under their supervision.
Okay. The name of the book is Innovative State, How New Technologies Can Transform Government. Aneesh Chopra, we appreciate your time with us here today on americasdemocrats.org. It's okay for you to be partisan here on this program. You can do it anytime you like. And we do look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
All right. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Washington, D.C.'s Mayor for Life.
If you're talking Washington, D.C., you're talking Mayor Marion Barry. He has had an incredible career. active in the civil rights movement. Moved here to Washington, D.C., community organizer in Washington, then elected mayor of Washington, D.C., served 2 terms. Got a little bit
Four terms.
Well, I'm coming back to it.
Okay.
Got a little trouble.
Okay.
Went away and then came back and served another 2 terms as mayor, 4 terms total as mayor of Washington, D.C., and still a member at large on the Washington City Council. And he is here in the studio with us. He has a new book out called Mayor for Life, which is what we all call him, Mayor for Life. It's good to see you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Bill. I'm glad to be on your show.
It's an honor to have you in the studio, Mr. Mayor. You know, looking back at your career, what's the thing you're most proud of?
Well, I wrote this book because people talk about what I am. I'm the full-time mayor, I'm this, I'm that, actor, civil rights. But nobody has written who I am.
Yeah.
The person, the character, the values, the feelings, the thoughts, the vision, etc. And so I wrote this book to try to give people a larger glimpse and a larger look at Marion Barry, the person. I'm 78 years of age, born in 1936 in the Delta of Mississippi, segregated society, poor, very poor. My mother and father were sharecroppers. That means the white man, sells you the seeds at a price higher than he paid for them for cotton, and he buys the cotton back from you at a price lower than he's going to get for it. So it's a very exploitive system. My mother and father used to work chopping cotton from 10 hours a day, averaging about $3 a day if they were just workers. And my mother, I have 2 sisters, one year and 9 months younger than me, Lily. And I had another sister, Elizabeth. And my mother got tired of it. She said, I'm tired of having babies. I'm tired of working my behind off. And it was about $2,000 or $3,000 total money for the whole year.
For the whole year?
For the whole year, $3,000 or $4,000 at the most. We had a garden, we had pigs, we had, we didn't have any cows. We know somebody who did. And so she wanted to leave. That was during the period of the Great Migration. In Mississippi, Tennessee, and the South, people were migrating to the North. Mississippi and Tennessee, primarily Chicago, supposed to be freedom land. And my grandmother had moved to Chicago about 4 or 5 years before my mother decided she wanted to leave. And my grandmother sent my mother some bus fare. My father found it, took it, because he didn't want to go. And she had to suffer around some white folks' kitchen, doing this, doing that. So she finally got enough money to take us across the river to Arkansas, West Alabama. And then from there she worked a little bit in people's kitchens and houses. And we got to Memphis. We had a lot of relatives in Memphis.
Yeah.
A lot of relatives in Memphis. And so I had a hard life. I lived in a house without any running water, without any electricity, with kerosene lamps, and extreme poverty. And what I'm most proud of in general, how God has blessed me with a tenacity, a courage, a vision, etc., to overcome. It's an overcoming book. Overcome poverty. It's hard. Most people who are born in poverty die in poverty. That's true here in Washington, D.C. That's true all over America. There are certainly a few of us who escape from that, but it's incredible, tough to do that. I mean, if you look at all of the people who were born in that period with me, and I don't know them, but just statistically, very few of them got out of poverty.
Yeah.
Very few of them went to college.
You were active, and then so you're in Memphis, and you were active in the early civil rights movement of. Do you want to check with the mayor there with IFB too? In the early civil rights movement, there are pictures in here of you with Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and all the great civil rights leaders at the time. We're now celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. But So have we achieved the dream, Mr. Mayor? Have we achieved equality? Is that all behind us?
No, never. Unfortunately, racism and some vestiges of segregation are still with us. We made a tremendous amount of progress. But one thing that I do know, Bill, is that anything that black people have gotten, we had to take it, had to fight for it.
Mm-hmm.
In 1848, Frederick Douglass, who's the sage of Anacostia, said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will." Look at the Voting Rights Act. Look what it took. It took people going to jail, took Fannie Hamer and other people, Herbert Lee being killed in Pike County, trying to register to vote. It took all that effort to finally get the President Johnson, the Voting Rights Act. Then look at the Civil Rights Act. It took a lot of us going to jail, sitting on lunch counters, getting beat up, the Freedom Riders, all that kind of stuff. It came at a price, and that is why I want to emphasize my life has been one of fighting for
absolutely,
right,
yep,
fighting for justice, fighting for human rights, fighting for gay and lesbian rights, fighting for all kinds of rights. But more importantly, I've been working as hard as I could to try to figure out how we close the economic gap between the haves and the have-not. Here we are in Washington. I've been here since '65. We're the richest city, the richest country in America. But we have become, in most urban cities, the haves and the have-nots. And so that's where we are. We had to. There's a lot of in-betweens that I worked on about rebuilding Washington, et cetera.
But it must be a disappointment to you who fought so hard for the Voting Rights Act to see this Supreme Court, this Roberts Court last year, basically gut the Voting Rights Act and say, well, states can go back to doing whatever the hell they want to do. And many of them have, making it harder, particularly for students, for minorities, to get out and vote.
It's been creeping up on us. Mm-hmm. It didn't happen all of a sudden. It's been creeping up. You know, we have a divided court with Clarence Thomas on the majority, conservative side, 5-4. Most major decisions have become 5-4. It's not like the Supreme Court that Thurgood Marshall was on, and others that were the liberal court in terms of progressiveness and candidate rights, etc. So, see, nothing in this country disappoints me. I mean, I'm sorry, surprises me, but it disappoints me.
Yeah.
We fought so hard. And also, this year, there's the 50th anniversary of the Summer Project in Mississippi, where we had 1,000 mostly white people coming down to open Mississippi up. And 3 civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Goodman, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, got assassinated down there. So
Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Yeah. So we have, I think the fight now, and it's in my book too, the fight now is economics. It's what I call civil rights, SILVER, civil rights. Closing the income gap. I'll give you an example. Here in Washington, D.C., I represent an area of Washington, across the river, Ward 8. The average income is $26,000 for the family, the average income. Whereas in Ward 3, which is 98% white, and I admire those persons who work very hard, the income is $200,000 a year. That's incredible.
Wow.
$200,000.
Average.
That's not a gap. That's a canyon. That
we
is
ain't lying.
huge.
It's a canyon.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm working now. I'm trying to get the council and the mayor and everybody to work on closing this economic gap because it affects the other gaps. It affects the achievement gap because it's shown that poor kids who come to school less prepared, etc. So that's where we are.
Yeah. He's telling his story for the first time in his book called Mayor for Life, the incredible story of Marion Barry Jr.
Let me tell you how that came about.
I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break, Mr. Mayor, if we can, and you'll tell us on the other side.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
No. Thank you for being here. Mayor, look, he's in charge, but this is the only time I'm able to interrupt the mayor here.
This is your show.
The mayor for life of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry Jr., his new book is called Mayor for Life. Mr. Mayor, I have to tell you, when I came here to do in 1996, CNN to do Crossfire, and my very first, and we live a block and a half from here on 8th Street, Southeast.
Okay.
So we live in the same part of Washington. I'm not in your ward. And right here at the corner of 9th and Pennsylvania, that first weekend, I saw a man wearing a T-shirt, had your picture on it, and the theme on the T-shirt said, this was right after your little troubles, let's say, said, I've seen the video, the bitch set him up. Did the bitch set you up?
Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, Bill, because that's just a sliver of my life.
True.
The FBI spent millions of dollars to try to entrap me. I shouldn't have gone up to that hotel room, should have gone to the hotel, but that's besides the point. The point is that 9 jurors out of 12 voted to acquit me on all charges. And I've never been convicted of anything at the Vista. Mm-hmm. Now, there was another charge at another hotel that we did, and we had a racist judge who gave me 6 months. But that only strengthened my life in terms of my endurance. To have the federal government throw everything they could after me, and the jurors didn't believe them. 9 of them didn't. And so I'm moving on. I moved on. It's been 24 years ago.
You did move on. Yeah.
I've done an incredible amount of time. Things like Washington, D.C. You came here in 96. You should have come here in 65. Washington, D.C. was a sleepy, southern-like town. No high-rise buildings. Not one new building on Pennsylvania Avenue. Not anything on K Street. Not anything on G, F, and all those other streets. The West End was desolate. Georgetown was just still kind of get its sea legs on Wisconsin Avenue. And if you look at Washington now, everything which is happening came out of my blueprint. All this development's going on started then because of my attitude about business. I wanted Washington to be the metropolis that it is now, where businesses are welcome. One of the first thing I did when I came in 79 was tell the business community we're open for business. Not any legal business, but open for business.
Well, boy, it sure changed sense.
So, we cut through a lot of red tape. We got buildings built. We got investments made in Washington. We doubled the number of hotel rooms because we created a climate for these 18 million people who come here. And Washington is Marion Barry, Washington.
You got it, yeah. And it's a great city today. One of the great cities in the world. Peter,
you talk about the sleepy town that it used to be. There's a documentary called "The 9 Lives of Marion Barry," which is a great documentary. I think that really shows what you did to Washington D.C. when you started to push to make it into a major American city, not a sleepy southern town. So I have to mention I thought that was a very good documentary. But my question for you is, where's Washington, D.C. going next?
Well, something was happening to Washington was very troublesome. We are being quickly gentrified. Long-term residents who lived on Capitol. I used to live on Capitol Hill. I lived at 6th and A. I lived at 7th and Maryland Avenue. And I was living at 1236 East Street when I got elected mayor, Northeast. And when I first came to Washington, there still was some degree of housing segregation. And so white people were buying houses from the Capitol to 8th Street. That was the boundaries. And Maryland Avenue on the north and the freeway on the south. But look at it now. Down as far as the jail, 19th Street, Bay Street, as far over as K Street, and et cetera. And I'm for new people moving in. But I'm opposed to long-term residents being forced out. Now, I know there's some economics here because there's some seniors who bought their houses 30, 25 years ago at, say, $30,000, $40,000. Now they're being offered $400,000.
Right.
You know,
or more.
More. I would take it, but gentrification is rabid. Shaw, Capitol Hill is gone, which means we're eliminating affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm putting a lot of emphasis on is home ownership for black people, because if you own your home, you're more than likely going to be stable. The neighborhood's going to be stable.
Right.
You look after things. But if you rent, like anything else, you be even put out.
I got to ask you the burning question about Washington, D.C. We're almost out of time, but should we change the name of the football team in Washington, D.C.?
Absolutely, we should. I've told Dan
Have
Snyder.
You told Dan Snyder that?
I've told everybody that. Dan Snyder, misreads the tea leaves. He went out and tried to buy support from the Native Americans. They told him they take his money, but they still voted against him. They took his money. I think we're going to rename the team the Washington Warriors, which means you don't have to change the logo or anything else.
Oh, yeah.
Washington Warriors, because that's strength. Warriors. I was watching something the other day on what happened at Wounded Knee, which was an awful massacre. And I've been a strong supporter of the AIM movement and other Native American fights, because so much injustice was done to the Native Americans.
Oh.
The long march to Florida,
right?
All that kind of thing. But no, I think I'm going to start a movement to name it that. I'm going to do all I can to meet with Dan Snyder, talk to him about it, get him to see the light. President Obama supports that effort. Everybody.
So you can see that the Mayor for Life still has a lot of life and a lot of fight left in him. He tells this incredible story again.
And buy the book, Bill, on Amazon.com. Amazon.com.
Not only that, on our website.
Your website?
We'll put up a link, too, for buying the book. Okay?
We appreciate that.
Mr. Mayor, you've had a great life.
The book is taken off. I mean, it really is.
Great contribution here.
Omar did a good job.
Good.
Helped me write it, and it's just taken off.
All right.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks for all your leadership and all you've done for the city of Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Bill.
All right.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Lina Khan, Aneesh Chopra, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate.